It felt as if I had been driving for what seemed like an eternity. Definitely over 2 hours, on my way to the Marriott in Baltimore. Sophie was attending a conference there, and I thought it would be a lovely surprise to whisk her away for dinner. But if I'm being honest, there was a much darker motive behind this trip. For the past 3 months, an insistent feeling of dread had gnawed at me, making me believe Sophie was involved with someone else. Whenever she embarked on these work trips or training sessions, she always came back later than she had promised. This evening, I was resolved to catch her in the act if necessary. I had to quell the doubts that were eating away at me. After 14 years of marriage and raising 2 wonderful kids, Chloe, our 12-year-old daughter, and Ethan, who is 10, I simply couldn't let this unsettling suspicion fester any longer. The kids were spending the night at my mother's house, providing me with the perfect opportunity to confront Sophie about my fears. We had gotten married right after high school, having dated for a couple of years prior. Sophie used to light up the room. Her long brown hair and stunning figure drew all kinds of attention. But something had shifted over the last few months. Little things began to disturb me, creating an underlying tension that I couldn't shake. Not wanting to seem paranoid or excessively jealous, I stuffed my concerns deep down. The proximity of this conference felt like a golden opportunity for me to drop in unannounced. Upon arriving at the hotel, I handed my suit bag to the front desk and introduced myself as Derek Thompson. I told the clerk that my wife, Sophie, was attending the insurance conference in room 214 and that she had mentioned I could collect a key. After verifying my identity, the clerk handed me the key, and I inhaled deeply as I headed toward the elevator. My nerves were frayed as I thought about what I might do if I actually caught her red-handed. Should I knock? Or just barge in without warning? Would she be alone? As I made my way down the corridor, I resolved to use the key and uncover the truth myself. I tried to tiptoe quietly as I slid the key card into the door and eased it open. What I stumbled upon was utterly shocking. Sophie sat at the desk with her briefcase wide open, deeply engrossed in some paperwork. She turned around, her face morphing from surprise to disbelief at my sudden appearance. I quickly fabricated a story about having some free time and thought I'd surprise her with dinner. To my relief, Sophie seemed genuinely thrilled to see me. She suggested I stay the night, her excitement palpable. She walked over and kissed me, and in that instant, I realized my plan to confront her had completely unraveled. Yet, as I jokingly suggested we enjoy a little quality time together before dinner, she gave me a sly smile and proposed we share a quick, intimate moment before she hopped in the shower. She even promised a full night of whatever I desired afterward. For a fleeting moment, a wave of relief washed over me. Perhaps I had been overthinking things. We shared a brief but intense encounter, and then Sophie slipped into the bathroom for her shower. I took a deep breath, attempting to push aside my earlier suspicions, and sat on the edge of the bed. As I settled there, my gaze fell on Sophie's toiletry bag resting on the dresser. I considered rummaging through it for some aspirin to ease the headache that had developed during the long drive. However, instead of finding relief, I stumbled upon something that made my heart plummet. A pack of 6 condoms. I stared at them, my thoughts racing. After Ethan was born, Sophie had switched to birth control pills, which had made her nauseous, prompting me to undergo a vasectomy. Since then, we hadn't needed any form of contraception. So why on earth were there condoms in her bag? The painful truth hit me like a freight train. She was cheating on me. There was simply no other rational explanation. But what was I supposed to do now? I couldn't just sweep this under the rug. My mind spiraled through a chaotic storm of thoughts, and then I found myself doing something I wasn't proud of. I rummaged through her bag and unearthed a safety pin, the type she always kept handy for wardrobe malfunctions. With painstaking precision, I poked holes in the center of each condom before placing them back exactly where I had found them. As Sophie continued her shower, I grabbed my phone and dialed my friend Kyle. He's the kind of guy who would drop anything for a friend without batting an eye. I needed a favor, nothing too outrageous, just a simple phone call. I explained that I wanted him to ring me in about an hour and pretend there was an emergency back home. Something like a burst pipe at the school that needed my immediate attention. Without a moment's hesitation, Kyle agreed, promising to call around 7. At that instant, I realized I no longer wanted to spend the night with Sophie. Not after what I had just uncovered. The mere thought of being intimate with her now sent a chill down my spine. I figured Kyle's call would provide the perfect excuse to leave and sort through my emotions during the drive home. When Sophie finally emerged from the bathroom, I struggled to meet her eyes. Every instinct screamed at me to confront her right then and there, to demand the truth. But I held back, knowing that losing my temper wouldn't help my case. I needed to stay composed and think strategically about my next move. We made our way down to the hotel dining room, and I did my best to act normally, though inside, I felt like I was disintegrating. Sophie appeared completely oblivious to the chaos brewing within me. As we sat down at the table, I encouraged her to order anything she wanted. She shrugged and said she wasn't particularly hungry, opting for a small filet mignon and suggesting we share a bottle of rose. After we placed our order, I couldn't help but probe a bit. I casually asked her if she was happy in our marriage. Without missing a beat, she replied that she was. She went on about how we had a beautiful home, 2 fantastic kids, and a devoted husband who adored her. She insisted she couldn't ask for anything more. I nodded along, but her words struck me like a punch to the gut. How could she say that with a straight face while betraying me behind my back? I found myself confessing that sometimes I worried I wasn't doing enough to keep Sophie satisfied. Despite my doubts, I made a point of emphasizing how lucky I felt to have her as my partner. I even joked about needing to pinch myself occasionally to believe our life together was real. Sophie laughed, affectionately calling me a silly goose. "You really don't need to worry," she said, flashing a smile that seemed genuine. "I'm happy and content." When our meals arrived, we engaged in light conversation, but my thoughts were miles away, burdened by the shocking discovery of those condoms. Just as we cleared our plates, my phone buzzed. Kyle, right on cue. I excused myself and stepped into the lobby to take the call, intentionally lingering longer than necessary to gather my thoughts before returning to the table. When I walked back, I told Sophie that Kyle had called about a burst pipe at the school and that I needed to leave immediately. The look on her face changed. She appeared deflated, though I couldn't tell if she was genuinely upset or just annoyed that our evening was being cut short. Either way, my abrupt departure didn't seem to trouble her as much as I had hoped. No matter what came next, I knew the consequences of her actions were looming. As we approached the elevator, a man I didn't recognize stepped out, greeting Sophie like an old friend. He introduced himself as Jason Reynolds, casually mentioning that he had dropped by her room earlier but hadn't received a response. Extending his hand toward me, he said, "Sophie talks about you all the time." "I'm Jason." I forced a smile and shook his hand, but maintaining any semblance of warmth felt nearly impossible as we rode up together. The knot in my stomach tightened painfully. This had to be the man entangled with my wife. Once we reached our room, I turned to Sophie and asserted firmly that I wanted her to quit her job. The thought of her working alongside Jason was unbearable. We talked about this before, but now I needed to lay down the law. This was non-negotiable. Sophie shot back immediately, her voice tinged with indignation as she insisted she wouldn't quit and that I needed to get over my unfounded paranoia regarding her and Jason. It felt like she was shifting the blame, painting me as the one with the problem while her betrayal lingered in the air. After a quick, cold kiss, I grabbed my bags and stormed out of the hotel, my mind spiraling with a mix of fury and betrayal. The entire drive home, I couldn't shake the image of Jason casually standing outside Sophie's room. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I was a bundle of nerves. I hated Sophie for her deceit, and I despised myself for feeling so helpless to stop it. Thoughts of divorce consumed my mind. Yet without solid proof, I felt completely powerless. I knew Sophie was unfaithful, but I was trapped in a frustrating limbo, unable to take any decisive action. 2 days later, when Sophie returned from the conference, she acted as if nothing was amiss. Her cheerful demeanor grated on my nerves, igniting my simmering rage. While she unpacked, I felt an overwhelming urge to check her bag again. To my dismay, there it was. One last condom, still bearing the tiny hole I had punctured. How many had she gone through in just a few days? The thought churned my stomach with disgust. That Saturday, Sophie's employer, Liberty Insurance, organized a picnic for employees and their families. The kids were excited about the outing, but I was filled with dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that some of her coworkers might know about the affair, and the thought of becoming the target of office gossip or crude jokes made my skin crawl. Perhaps I was being paranoid, but after everything I'd been through, it felt justified. Sophie thrived at the picnic, laughing and mingling with her colleagues, including Jason. They weren't openly affectionate, but their exchanges buzzed with a familiarity that sent chills down my spine. It was as if the world around them faded away whenever they spoke. I tried to remain inconspicuous, hoping to avoid drawing any attention to myself. Then, out of nowhere, a striking woman approached me. "Hi, I'm Natalie Reynolds." She introduced herself, revealing that she was Jason's wife. She was stunning. Long auburn hair cascading down her back and piercing blue eyes. The kind of woman who looked like she belonged in a high-fashion magazine. For a moment, I felt completely disoriented. How could Jason betray someone like her? I had always admired Sophie, had loved her deeply, but Natalie was in an entirely different league of beauty. We exchanged pleasantries, and after some small talk, we decided to find a quieter corner to chat. We settled onto a couple of benches by the lake, far enough from the picnic crowd to have a private conversation. As we sat there, it was evident that Natalie had something weighing heavily on her mind. She hesitated, visibly grappling with how to approach the topic. To make it easier for her, I decided to be blunt and admitted that I had discovered the affair just that week. The relief that washed over her was palpable. She confessed that she had known about it for 2 months and had already made up her mind to file for divorce. In fact, she had enlisted the help of a private investigator to gather evidence. Natalie explained that her lawyer had suggested asking Sophie to testify or at least provide a notarized statement regarding the affair to strengthen her case. When I inquired about the evidence she had, she mentioned photographs and recorded phone conversations, though no videos yet. She seemed confident that the proof she gathered would be more than enough to build a solid case. Then she posed a question that caught me completely off guard. Would I be willing to use some of the same evidence in my own divorce proceedings? She also disclosed her intent to sue Liberty Insurance for negligence, revealing that she had statements from other employees who were aware of the affair but chose to turn a blind eye. Natalie was determined to ensure that both Jason and Sophie faced the repercussions of their actions. Natalie proposed that we combine our efforts, sharing whatever evidence we had gathered, and I quickly agreed. It felt like a logical move to team up before returning to the picnic. She invited me to her home the next day, explaining that Jason would be out golfing in the morning, a perfect opportunity for us to go through everything she had compiled. Her house was at 26 Hemlock Avenue in Crest, Montana, just a short drive from where we were. We shared a knowing chuckle, aware that our meeting wasn't exactly a date. Yet there was something comforting about navigating this tumultuous situation together. When we returned to the picnic area, it appeared that no one had noticed we were gone. For a fleeting moment, I felt a spark of hope, as if maybe, just maybe, there was a way to untangle this chaotic web after all. The following morning unfolded just as I had anticipated. Sophie announced her plans to go shopping, claiming she would be out for a few hours. As soon as she left, I wasted no time dropping the kids off at my mother's house before heading to Natalie's. When I arrived, she welcomed me at the door with an air of calmness, guiding me into her den. The room exuded a cozy warmth, furnished with a plush leather couch and a computer monitor that currently displayed an empty motel room. Natalie gestured for me to sit and offered me a drink. I opted for a soda, specifically a Pepsi, then asked her what we were about to witness. A glimmer of excitement lit up her face as she replied that we were about to watch Jason play a round of golf, live and in stunning detail. Intrigued, I inquired how she had arranged this setup. She mentioned a familiar face, the caddy, and casually dropped that the whole thing had cost her around $1,400, but she was certain Jason would end up covering that expense one way or another. With the session expected to last a couple of hours, she encouraged me to settle in. She even had popcorn and nachos ready, promising to send me home with a DVD of the entire event. Natalie admitted that while she wasn't exactly looking forward to what was about to unfold, she felt compelled to stick around for at least the next 20 minutes. As we engaged in small talk, she began to lay out the intricate details of the affair, revealing photos, audio recordings, and documentation that laid bare the depth of Sophie and Jason's connection. Each revelation struck a painful chord within me, yet it was the hard evidence I desperately needed. Then, as Natalie had anticipated, the monitor flickered to life. There they were, Jason and Sophie entering the motel room, seemingly oblivious to the camera. They wasted no time undressing, diving headfirst into intimacy without so much as a greeting. The video was strikingly clear, though the audio was somewhat muffled. Watching my wife with another man felt surreal, like a violation of everything I held dear. It was one of the most agonizing experiences I had ever endured. To lighten the mood, Natalie made a quip about how you rarely see a figure like Sophie's. I managed a strained smile, but internally, I felt hollow. It was too surreal. I didn't want to watch anymore. After enduring a few more excruciating minutes, I turned to Natalie and confessed that I couldn't bear to see the rest. I sensed she wasn't keen on continuing either. Natalie sighed in agreement, admitting that the experience was just as painful for her. We decided to stop the video, recognizing that the lawyers already had ample evidence. I opened up to Natalie, sharing how watching my wife in such a compromising position, especially with her right beside me, was something I could hardly tolerate. Felt so fundamentally wrong. Natalie nodded, her empathy evident, and suggested we change the subject. A wave of relief washed over me when she mentioned showing me her koi ponds in the backyard. Anything was better than enduring another moment of that wretched video. Her eyes lit up with enthusiasm at my interest in her hobby, and she seemed genuinely excited to share it with me. As we walked outside to the backyard, I couldn't help but think how this afternoon was turning out to be far more enjoyable for me than for Sophie. The koi ponds were absolutely stunning, each one more impressive than the last. Natalie explained the intricate pumping and filtration systems, and I found myself captivated, especially given my background in plumbing. I offered to help her whenever she needed it, genuinely eager to learn more about her beautiful ponds. Spending time with Natalie felt refreshing, though I wasn't seeking anything romantic, at least, not yet. We lost track of time, discussing everything except our unfaithful spouses. It was a much-needed distraction from the emotional turmoil. When we finally returned indoors, the monitor displayed an empty motel room, signaling that Jason and Sophie had departed. It was time for me to head home. Natalie walked me to the door, promising to call when Jason scheduled his next golf game, suggesting I bring Chloe and Ethan over to see the koi ponds. That thought felt like a glimmer of hope, something positive to anticipate amidst the chaos. As I drove home, a storm of emotions crashed over me. Relief washed in, mingled with anger, and a flicker of hope dared to surface, whispering that perhaps I could navigate this chaos after all. The weeks ahead loomed dauntingly. Each time Sophie slipped into the shower, I felt an overwhelming compulsion to rifle through her bag. Each search unveiled yet another stash of condoms, and I found myself baffled, wondering when she was finding the time to use them all. It felt like she was living a life I had no insight into, leading a double existence right under my nose. I kept that safety pin on my keychain, always ready to puncture holes in her stash whenever I discovered a new batch. On the days when Jason was off golfing, I took the kids to visit Natalie, whom they fondly referred to as the koi lady. They cherished their time with her, creating vibrant drawings of the fish that they proudly showcased to Sophie upon our return. It was almost laughable how clueless she seemed, never connecting the dots that Natalie was, in fact, Jason's wife. Sophie appeared relieved to have me keep the kids entertained while she lost herself in her distractions, oblivious to the charade. I made several attempts to discuss the idea of quitting her job and severing ties with Jason, but every conversation ended with her cold dismissal. The second time, in particular, was a low blow. She attacked my masculinity, suggesting that I was the real issue in our relationship. Those harsh exchanges only fueled my rationalizations for my actions, making it easier to slip further away from her. I began fabricating excuses to dodge any intimacy with her. The less we interacted, the more alienated I felt. Then, one evening, Sophie dropped a bombshell. She claimed she was feeling overwhelmed and thought it best to take some time off to visit her sister Rachel. She casually mentioned that she planned to be away for a few days, maybe even a week. In a disingenuous show of concern, she pointed out how hard I had been working, racking up those overtime hours and late nights. She presented her trip as a generous opportunity for both of us to relax, as if it were a selfless act. That night, sleep eluded me, my mind racing with plans and schemes. The time to act had finally arrived. The following day, after Sophie left for her so-called time away, I jumped into action. I knew I had to confront my parents, admitting to them that I had utterly failed as a husband. Their support was immediate and unwavering, as they offered their help without a second thought. The kids were thrilled to stay with their grandparents, and my dad's truck was perfect for packing up Sophie's belongings and getting her out of our house. On Thursday morning, I set out on a 3-hour drive to the clinic I suspected Sophie might visit, but I hit a brick wall. That left me with only one option: the family planning center. I strode into the building, determined to appear confident, and introduced myself to the receptionist, claiming to be Derek Thompson, Sophie's husband, there to sign some consent forms. Feigning ignorance, I acted unsure of the exact name of the form, mentioning it was related to understanding the procedure and signing away any legal rights. The receptionist nodded, her fingers dancing over the keyboard as she confirmed Sophie's identity. She informed me that Sophie's sister had already signed for her, but my signature would carry more weight. I hastily scribbled my name beneath Rachel's. The procedure was scheduled for Friday morning at 11 a.m., with instructions to arrive an hour early. When I asked about any outstanding payments, the receptionist assured me that Sophie had already covered the entire $800 in cash. I thanked her, leaving the clinic with a strange mix of relief and anxiety swirling within me. Everything was falling into place, and I could feel the pieces aligning for my next move. Upon arriving at Rachel and Tom's house, the air was thick with tension. Sophie looked genuinely shocked to see me, her eyes wide with disbelief as she asked what I was doing there. I explained that my parents had offered to care for the kids for a few days, so I had taken some sick leave to visit them. I casually added that I needed to unwind, just like she did, but the atmosphere shifted palpably. The room fell silent, and I could practically see the gears turning in their heads. I had put them in a tight spot, forcing them to navigate their response. Rachel exchanged a furtive glance with Tom, and he slipped into the kitchen with her. Sophie attempted to keep the conversation light, but I could sense her growing discomfort. When Tom returned, he suggested we take his buddy Jack's boat out on the lake the next day for some fresh air. I feigned enthusiasm, nodding in agreement that a day on the lake sounded delightful, even though I had zero intention of joining them. The next morning, Jack was already waiting with the boat when I made it clear to Tom that I wasn't going anywhere while he prepared lunch and stocked the cooler with beer. I stood by the passenger door of his truck when he asked if I was getting in. I told him point blank that I had changed my mind. There was no way I was going to waste a day on a boat with him and Jack. I suggested he make the most of it since he'd have to deal with Rachel when he returned, and I doubted she'd be in a good mood. Tom tried to convince me to come along, throwing out half-hearted threats and swearing. After several minutes of back and forth, it became clear to him that I wasn't going to relent. Ultimately, he gave up and he and Jack drove off without me. Once they were out of sight, I retreated into the house, poured myself a cup of coffee, and switched off Sophie's cell phone. I called my dad, who was always up early, and we chatted for a couple of hours while I ignored the constant calls waiting. It had to be Jason trying to reach Sophie. I suspected Tom must have warned Rachel about my presence, but I was determined to thwart their plans. Eventually, Sophie and Rachel stirred awake, and I ended my call with my dad, preparing myself for the inevitable confrontation as Rachel's phone buzzed back to life. They had only about 5 minutes left before they needed to be at the family planning center. I finished the last of the coffee and brewed a fresh pot for them, fully aware that I was walking into a minefield of backlash. Sophie shot me a look that could cut glass, her irritation palpable as she demanded to know why I was still hanging around. I shrugged nonchalantly, saying that fishing didn't sound appealing to me and I thought I'd stick around with them for the day. I suggested we find a nice place to grab lunch together since I had plans to leave that night. Without hesitation, Sophie shot down my suggestion, her voice tinged with annoyance. "We have plans, and I don't want you tagging along," she snapped, as if my very presence was a nuisance. "We only see each other a couple of times a year," she added, as if that justified her neglect of our life together. She reminded me that I had the entire week to spend with her, but I refused to back down. I countered, insisting that since I had driven all this way, the least she could do was spare me half a day of her time. Rachel, clearly at her wit's end, stepped outside to make a phone call. Sophie sat there, looking utterly defeated, as if I had blindsided her with my insistence. From the other room, we could hear Rachel's voice rising in anger, berating Tom for leaving me behind. Sophie attempted one last time to dissuade me from joining them, arguing that their plans didn't involve me and that I would only be an unwelcome intrusion. I stood my ground, calmly asserting that I wanted to know exactly what their plans were so I could decide whether to join them or find something else to do. I even made a half-hearted joke, asking if they were meeting some guys, which she quickly denied, her defensiveness evident. Sophie explained that their plans revolved around shopping for personal items, bras, underwear, nightgowns, definitely not something they wanted a man around for. I shrugged, pointing out that most of those stores were in the mall, making it easy for me to entertain myself while they shopped. I even offered to treat them to a nice lunch afterward, thinking it would be a good way to smooth over any inconvenience I was causing. Rachel reappeared in the doorway, glaring at me in silence. Sophie must have sensed she was losing this battle, because she finally relented, saying she needed to get dressed. About 20 minutes later, the two of them descended the stairs, clearly annoyed but resigned to my presence. I suspected that Rachel's earlier call had been to the family planning center, likely to reschedule their appointment. They probably thought they could wait me out and head to the center after I left. I insisted on driving my own car, making it clear I wouldn't let them leave me behind. When we stopped at a service station, I took my time filling the tank, checking the oil and cleaning the windshield. It was probably the longest I'd ever taken for such mundane car maintenance, and I could see their frustration boiling over in the passenger seats. Finally, we pulled into the mall parking lot, and I parked as far from the entrance as possible, ensuring we'd have a long walk ahead of us. Inside, I let them wander off to shop while I maintained my distance, lingering close enough to remind them I was still there. It was obvious they weren't enjoying themselves. They spent most of their time whispering to each other and exchanging irritated glances. They picked up a few items, but it felt more like a chore than a fun outing. I kept a close eye on their antics but had zero interest in their purchases. The key was that I had successfully delayed the inevitable. Their appointment time had come and gone, and I knew Sophie would need to reschedule. While I had no intention of outright stopping her from going through with it, I took a twisted satisfaction in complicating her plans. Around noon, we regrouped in the center court of the mall, just as we had planned. We decided to grab lunch at Olive Garden, and afterward we headed back to the house. The car ride was heavy with tension, marked by a suffocating silence. I could sense both women were seething with anger, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a surge of power. I was in control and it felt liberating. Once we got back to the house, I grabbed a beer and settled onto the couch, relishing my small victory. A few hours later, Tom returned, only to face a tirade from Rachel that lasted a solid half hour. After she had vented her frustrations, he slipped out again, disappearing until dinner time. Later that evening, after the dishes were cleared, I approached Sophie and asked if we could talk privately in the kitchen. Rachel shot me a look filled with disdain but kept her mouth shut as she and Sophie moved into the living room. Sophie still looked shaken from the day's events, and I knew I was in for a rough conversation. But I was ready for it. I wasted no time confronting her again, reiterating my demand that she quit her job and sever ties with Jason Reynolds. Sophie's jaw clenched as if she were holding back a storm, her eyes blazing with indignation. "I'm done with this conversation," she snapped, insisting I needed to drop it. She was fed up with my insistence, reminding me that I already knew her answer wouldn't change. With a sharp tone, she issued an ultimatum: change the subject or get out. But I wasn't going to back down this time. Instead, I reached into the manila envelope I had brought and pulled out a legal-sized envelope. Inside were the divorce papers. I confronted Sophie, reminding her that I had asked her at least 10 times over the past 2 months to quit her job and end her affair with Jason, and each time she had stubbornly refused. "It's time to make this official," I said, sliding the envelope across the table. "Sign the papers and mail them in." I even provided a self-addressed, stamped envelope for her convenience, making it as easy as possible. I told her she could have a lawyer review them if she wished, but I was done waiting for her to decide. Sophie's face twisted with rage. Leaning across the table, she hissed that I couldn't simply divorce her because she refused to quit her job or stop associating with someone I hated. "You need valid grounds for divorce, and you don't have any?" she snapped, her voice dripping with contempt. "I am your wife, and I refuse to give up my home or family just because you're uncomfortable with my career." I paused, choosing my words carefully, knowing a storm was brewing. Instead of getting drawn into her emotional whirlwind, I pulled out a series of photographs, laying them out in front of her. 6 images captured Sophie and Jason in various compromising positions. "Is this sufficient grounds for a divorce?" I asked, my voice steady. Sophie's face drained of color, and for a moment, I thought she might faint. But rather than feeling guilt or regret, she erupted in a furious tirade, demanding that I stop displaying the photos like trophies. "You've been spying on me. You're the most pathetic excuse for a husband," she yelled, hurling every derogatory term she could muster. Words like sneaky and underhanded fell from her lips, sharper than daggers. She insisted I should have confronted her directly, branding me a voyeur who thrived on scandalous discoveries. "Your actions make me sick," she spat, her disdain palpable. Just then, my phone buzzed. My dad was calling to inform me he'd be arriving in about 10 minutes with Sophie's belongings. After hanging up, I turned back to Sophie, still simmering with rage. When she demanded to know who had called, I replied coolly that my dad was on his way to drop off her things at Rachel's. I explained that I had already changed the locks at her house, and if she'd forgotten anything, I'd be willing to retrieve it for her. Sophie sat there, momentarily speechless, as I handed her the title to her car, which I had already signed over. I also presented her with an envelope containing half of our joint bank account funds, about $200. I detailed her visitation rights with the kids, once a week with the possibility of an overnight stay once a month, but only if she signed a statement admitting to the affair and had it notarized. Then, as if this wasn't enough, I casually mentioned that I had a DVD of her and Jason's little rendezvous at the Scandier Motel from May 10th. The footage lasted 2 hours, capturing every detail shown in the photos. As I collected the pictures back from the table, I made it clear that I hadn't taken them myself. I had no interest in her escapades. It was the deception that I couldn't abide. Finally, I pulled out the last item from my envelope, the safety pin I had been carrying around. I slid it across the table toward her, explaining that I had used it to poke holes in all the condoms she had been using for the past 2 months. I pointed out that she had gone through 48 condoms in just 2 weeks, an unbelievable quantity I never thought she'd actually use. Her complexion flushed crimson as she absorbed the weight of my words. "You're a pathetic weasel," she cried, insisting that my actions were the most despicable she had ever encountered. I stood firm, unshaken. I replied that the real despicable act was her betrayal. I might be a fool for having held on for so long, but she was the one who had shattered our vows. I informed her that I had to leave as my dad was pulling into the driveway. As I prepared to walk out, I noted that she hadn't once offered an apology or shown any remorse for her actions. I bid her farewell, wishing her the best with her upcoming procedure, not forgetting to remind her that it was scheduled for Monday. That's when the tears finally began to flow. As I stepped out of the room, Sophie crumbled into sobs. Rachel rushed in to comfort her, while Tom trailed behind me onto the porch. He looked at me, clearly struggling to understand the chaos that had just unfolded. You can't just throw away a 14-year marriage over what I see as a misunderstanding, he said, disbelief etched on his face. I challenged him, asking why Sophie had sought refuge with him and Rachel if that were true. Tom's gaze fell to his shoes, his expression revealing the struggle within him. After a beat, he mumbled an apology and offered to help unload the truck. We finished unloading in about 10 minutes, all while Sophie continued her emotional breakdown in the kitchen. I felt no sympathy for her tears. It was far too little, far too late. The following week, both Sophie and Jason were unceremoniously fired from Liberty Insurance. Sophie flatly refused to sign the affidavit that Natalie's lawyer had requested, but my lawyer was adamant that our case was robust enough to proceed without it. After that night, an eerie silence descended. Not a word from Sophie, no texts, no calls. She didn't even make an effort to see the kids. Strangely, they didn't seem to miss her. Instead, they were forming a bond with Natalie, and we found ourselves enjoying quality family time together. There was no hint of romance between Natalie and me, at least not yet. Our primary focus was on navigating our divorces and ensuring our kids felt secure during the upheaval. Over the following months, I discovered more about Coy than I ever thought I would, and I savored every moment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, both divorces were finalized. Sophie didn't put up much of a fight, but Jason went down swinging. He lost everything: the house, investments, and soon found himself burdened with steep alimony payments to Natalie, just days before Christmas. Sophie showed up at our home, arms laden with gifts for the kids. In an effort to keep the holiday spirit alive, I chose to be civil, masking my true feelings behind a polite facade. For about 2 hours, she played the role of the devoted mother before slipping away as quietly as she had arrived. We glossed over the painful realities of the divorce and her affair, almost as if those traumatic events were mere illusions. Yet, after her departure, I felt an unexpected sense of closure wash over me. The house was officially on the market, and 2 months later, I moved in with Natalie. Meanwhile, Jason secured a job in Omaha, whisking Sophie away with him 4 months later. Ultimately, he vanished completely, leaving Sophie clueless about his whereabouts. Sophie then moved back in with Rachel, who was also grappling with her own divorce after Tom accepted a job working on the Alaskan pipeline. Tom had sent Rachel the divorce papers through the mail, leaving the two sisters to lean on one another, both feeling abandoned by the men they had once depended on. Meanwhile, my life with Natalie blossomed. Our relationship developed into something wonderfully comfortable, and she genuinely adored my kids, who in turn showered her with affection. We cherished every moment together, and by June, we were deep into planning our wedding. We had both put the trauma of our previous marriages behind us and were eagerly anticipating a bright new future. Finally, life settled into a peaceful and joyous rhythm. As for the man Sophie had left me for, his luck ran out quickly. A few weeks after his disappearance, I caught wind of the news. He had been mugged outside his favorite bar. The assailants left him in shambles, with 5 broken ribs, shattered kneecaps, and a handful of missing teeth. In the brutal attack, he lost not just his wallet but also one of his testicles. It felt like the universe had finally served him the justice he deserved, bringing an end to his reckless and carefree lifestyle. Natalie and I continued to strengthen our bond, evolving into not just romantic partners but a true family unit. The kids and I dove into learning about koi, relishing countless blissful afternoons in the backyard, marveling at the fish gliding gracefully through the water as we built the tranquil life we had long desired. After everything we had endured, it finally felt like we were achieving the happiness we had always deserved. The days of chaos and betrayal were behind us, replaced by the simple joys of togetherness. One day, Natalie surprised me with thrilling news. She had purchased a stunning 6-bedroom villa nearby, funded by the savings she had set aside before selling her business. The villa was beautiful, complete with a spacious swimming pool where we could bask in the sun during the sweltering summer days. To my delight, Natalie had even preserved my old Chevrolet Corvette, hiding it away in the garage all this time. It stood as a charming reminder of better days, patiently awaiting our next scenic drive along the coast. That day was fast approaching. We planned to visit a beloved French restaurant, where the three of us, me, Natalie, and the Corvette, could enjoy a leisurely meal and celebrate our journey together. As for Sophie, the last I heard, she was still living with Rachel, trying to piece her life back together after Jason's betrayal. But that was no longer my concern. I had finally moved on, ready to embark on a new chapter with Natalie by my side, both of us filled with excitement about the future that lay ahead.